Well, as part of our Brazil series and other series on sports and international relations, we've hosted a number of faculty, both on campus and from around the country, who have turned their passion for baseball or soccer into academic work. And when Professor Stiles was talking earlier this year about his research into microstates, I thought, what a really interesting project to address some of these countries that many of us have heard about but don't know a lot about, and to kind of draw together some research and thinking on what goes on with these microstates. Well, Ken Stiles is a professor of political science at BYU and international relations coordinator here at the Kennedy Center. He came to BYU in 2003 after teaching for several years in Loyola in Chicago, and Bowling Green State University in Ohio. His current research is on international law and cooperation. His publications include the forthcoming book, Complies, which will be published next year, Cooperating Without America with Stefan Brem, and International Norms and Cycles of Change with Wayne Sandholz. Professor Stiles received a BA and an MA from Brigham Young University and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He and his wife, Rebecca, are the parents of 5 children, and they have 10 grandchildren. The topic for today's presentation, trust between European microstates and their neighbors. Please welcome Professor Ken Stiles.
Thank you very much, Corey, and thank you, Ethan, for that delightful prayer, and greetings to all of you, as well as all of you listening online and all the ships at sea, as they say. What got me interested in this topic was the broader question of cooperation, international cooperation. That is, a lot of folks think that that's very difficult to achieve, and if you look around the world, I think many of you will agree. One of the theories out there is that cooperation requires trust. A lot of this comes from studies in sociology, anthropology, and so forth that tell us that if we're going to get along, we need to believe that other people are going to be looking out for us. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that because I think it's possible to have cooperation without trust. On the other hand, I'm not sure that it's possible to have cooperation with distrust. That may be the deal breaker. Corey, what do I need to do to get the, pushed it twice with the gap. Let's see here. If we could get these slides going, that would help. Otherwise, I can improvise a little bit, I suppose. Okay, that's fine. I don't know if you, there we go. I don't know if any of you have read works by Robert Putnam or others, but they argue that trust is what binds us, and then they say that this may also apply to international relations. One of the problems with this notion, though, I think, is that they often use different definitions of the word trust. In some cases, what they're really just talking about is predictability, that you can trust that certain actors are going to do certain things in certain circumstances. And that allows for you to make adjustments and accommodations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything that's socially beneficial. The next level, some people say it really is about reliability, keeping promises, honoring contracts, this sort of thing. And I tend to think that that is an essential element, but I'm not sure that we need to use the word trust to describe that. We've already got the word reliability, and trust has some loaded connotations that muddy the water a bit. Empathy is another element that some people may think is part of trust, and I tend to agree with that because to me the useful definition of trust is this idea that you're in a situation where someone could take advantage of you and might actually want to take advantage of you, but will choose not to. You believe that they will look out for your interests even though, like I say, they're in a position to exploit you. That is the kind of trust that most of us are thinking of when we talk about trust in interpersonal relations. The big question is whether that applies to countries, okay? The fact is, It's possible for individual leaders to have trust in each other. We hear about stories of Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan getting to be good friends that carried over after they were both out of office and so forth. But there are good reasons to think that maybe governments should not necessarily engage in trust, because in doing so, they actually expose not only themselves as leaders, but also all of their constituents to exploitation. One of the things I like to point out is that we never talk about betrayal unless there is trust in the first place. So if you don't want to be betrayed, then don't trust. I'm not recommending that as a lifestyle necessarily, but as a public policy, that might not be a bad thing to remember. Okay, we'll talk about Luxembourg in just a minute and how they trusted when perhaps they shouldn't have. Like I said, I don't think that cooperation requires trust. On the other hand, I think chronic distrust can get in the way of cooperation. If you really believe that everybody is going to break every agreement, then you probably won't launch into that. But I think there's something in between distrust and trust, which I would refer to, this is the reliability component that I mentioned earlier. That said, I was curious to see whether there are countries out there that engage in trust. I admit that I was skeptical when I launched this. It was about 2 years ago, the book project. It'll probably take another year or so, but I decided that if there were trust, this is what it would look like. We would find it in democracies that allow themselves to become dependent on some other more powerful country. Why? Well, because it's elective. Trust has to be elective. It doesn't count if it's imposed. Colonies don't trust. I'm not sure where Crimea fits right now, but if a major power has taken over your territory, then trust isn't really in play. It has to be elective. And the best way to see whether a policy is elective is to see how the decision was made. And in a democracy, you have a chance for people to contribute and participate in the decision. So I would expect that trust would be most active in a democracy that is choosing to become, I guess, to put itself in a position to be exploited. And one of the best indications of that is that they've disarmed, that they've entered into binding long-term agreements with a major power that would have an incentive to take advantage of the situation. Okay, it's a risky situation, to be sure, but again, if there's trust going on, I would expect to see it there. And as it just so happens, there's a category of countries that fit that description. Here's some more detail if you want to look at that. Basically, we'd expect that these commitments would be deep, would be across a wide variety of important issues, not just superficial things, that they would be long-lasting, that they would often be rather vague in the sense that, well, I often compare this to a marriage commitment. Most of us would be a little nervous if our partner came forward with language that provided for specific detailed performances. You know, as my spouse, you will take out the garbage every week, and you will give me receipts of all your transactions in triplicate, and this will only last for 3 years, renewable at the behest of both parties, co-signed by our parents, with the dispute going to my brother-in-law. You know, that would be awkward. I don't know if you ever watched the TV show Big Bang Theory, but the protagonist there is famous for having a roommate agreement that goes on for about 70 pages. Then he had a girlfriend, and he created a relationship agreement that was similar, where they consider all contingencies and so forth. So vague language is more indicative of trust than precise language. Commitments that are difficult to get out of would also be more indicative of trust than commitments that have a short time period or they're very easy to get out of. And one would expect over time that these kinds of things would intensify, that countries would become more committed to relationship rather than less as they get to know each other and have positive experiences. So again, microstates fit the bill, and my research is to ask whether this describes the kind of arrangements that these countries have actually entered into. If so, then I'll have to concede that trust is quite active. If not, then that may mean that there's really not much trust at all in international relations, because this is what we call a most likely case. These are the most likely examples. So what are microstates about? Well, Luxembourg is the largest of the microstates I consider, with 500,000 people. Still quite a bit smaller than the state of Utah. I think it's even smaller than the state of Wyoming, isn't it? And only half of those people would be what you might call native Luxembourgers. Huge number, travel in and out of the country every day, an awful lot of residents from other countries. Looks like the thing isn't working again, but I hesitate to go too far along. Okay, there we go. Of the 5 microstates I'm considering, all but Luxembourg have no military and have not had military power for quite a long time. They do have some interesting topographical advantages. We'll see that when we look at some photographs from these places. They're all monarchies except for San Marino, which is perhaps the oldest republic in the world. Even Abraham Lincoln many years ago wrote notes to San Marino congratulating them on the longevity and strength of their republican institutions. And at this point, all are tax havens and are under tremendous pressure to conform to international standards on taxation. Anyway, here's where they are. You might also note that except for San Marino, although historically this was true, all of these countries are proximate to 2 major powers, not just one. Depending on how you classify Switzerland, probably not a major power. But the reason that's significant is because these countries have been able to play their neighbors off against each other. When one neighbor became a little bit too dominant, they would go to the other and say, you know, can we have a stronger relationship with you? And that would often make the first country back off a bit. So some people call these accidents of history. I think they're not really accidents in some respects. They've taken advantage of history. Most of the countries for a long time were also very poor and simply didn't attract a lot of attention. Liechtenstein, for instance, was pretty much destitute, just a little open farmer's field with cows and wheat, and that was about it. Nowadays, they're all extraordinarily wealthy. Luxembourg, for instance, has the highest gross national product per capita on the planet, which takes some doing when you think about all the wealthy countries out there. In fact, let's look more closely at Luxembourg. It's been around for hundreds of years as an entity. There's been a Grand Duke and other leaders of Luxembourg for a long time. For a while, though, it was part of the Netherlands, and you can see here the territory has been carved up by its neighbors, including Belgium, which it used to think was a friend. And so Luxembourg is a small shell of its former self. But these are the borders since 1839, so that's quite a while now. And they've had the same government pretty much since then. It's been demilitarized since the 1860s. It was assured by France and Germany, Prussia at the time, and Great Britain that its independence would be guaranteed and its territory inviolate. And then it was invaded in World War I and World War II. I remember the Luxembourg City Museum. This is, by the way, a picture of the old city of Luxembourg. You can see the topography is to its advantage. It's very difficult to attack a city that's elevated about 200 feet from the valley floor. They had barriers, walls, and fortresses on the other side of the city, but those were dismantled back in the 1860s when it disarmed. But that's part of the reason why Luxembourg was able to survive. Even France tried to occupy it and failed back during the Napoleonic period and so forth. But if you go to the Luxembourg City Museum, you'll see a plaque that begins the room full of Luxembourg history. It describes very candid terms in 3 languages the experience that Luxembourg has had. And basically they said Luxembourg trusted the great powers during the 19th and 20th centuries, and that proved to be disastrous. And so we've learned not to trust the major powers anymore. It's definitely a quote that's going in the book, put it that way. Trust turned out to be a disaster for Luxembourg. It has, since the 20th century, tried to find some kind of protector. It went to France right after World War I. France declined. It went to Belgium. Belgium accepted, and so they formed a very close customs union. Didn't help keep the Nazis out, and so after World War II, Luxembourg decided to initiate much of what we now think of as the standard European institutions. It was right there at the founding of the European Community organizations, now the European Union. It helped to create NATO. Before that, it was involved in creating the Benelux Association. So Luxembourg decided to take a completely different tack. Instead of relying on one country or another, or on the best intentions of the great powers, it decided to make the other countries partly dependent on it. And so Luxembourg, for instance, has been able to rotate through the EU presidency just like every other European Union member. It has had disproportionate influence over European affairs by virtue of its membership in the European Union. It's the host of many European Union institutions, organizations, but at the same time, it was able to get away with having a very low tax rate that allowed it to attract a huge amount of European capital. It's had to alter some of those policies now, so it's blending in a little bit more with the rest of Europe in that respect. But it's worked out quite well. Like I said, Luxembourg is basically the wealthiest country in the world. It's also an unusual country in the sense that it has essentially surrendered its national identity in favor of a cosmopolitan European identity. They're even going through the process of deciding whether to allow foreign residents to vote in all of their elections, including for prime minister and so forth. So they've just embraced this European identity, I think, more so than any other country in Europe. Next country is Liechtenstein. Some people think this is an adorable, cute little country. It is also a bit of an accident of history. It was created when the initial lords and dukes went bankrupt through their own profligate spending. The Holy Roman Emperor decided that was enough of that and solicited somebody to come in and buy the country and take care of the debts. And believe it or not, somebody by the name of Liechtenstein took him up on it, which is why the country has that name. It has nothing to do with the geography. Other than Saudi Arabia, it's the only country that's named after a family, in fact. But it became independent in the early 1700s, and in the 1800s, it depended very heavily on Austria-Hungary. All of these microstates struggle with some of the basics. Like I said, they don't bother with militaries as a rule. They have trouble with finance, and so they usually use some other country's currency. They have trouble with trade, and so they usually enter into a customs agreement and allow some other country to regulate their borders for them. When it comes to diplomacy, they usually ask another country to just handle things for them, to negotiate in their behalf, or to serve in the consulates and so forth around the world. So for a long time, if you were a citizen of Liechtenstein traveling overseas and you got into some kind of trouble, you would go to the Austria-Hungarian consulates, and they would take care of you, not the Liechtenstein consulate. However, Austria-Hungary, even though it was a major power, proved to be not a very reliable one. And in 1919, it had the misfortune of losing World War I and essentially going bankrupt and getting dismembered. Well, along with that, Liechtenstein went bankrupt, and so they decided it would be wise to go to some other country. They went to Switzerland first, and the Swiss, thinking of Liechtenstein as kind of a younger sibling almost, decided to help them out. This is, again, the topography of Liechtenstein is very advantageous. This is the Prince's Castle, you can see there, perched on a cliffside. Half of the country is behind that mountain that you see. When I say Switzerland thought of Liechtenstein as a younger sibling, I found a photograph that I think symbolizes how the Swiss viewed the people of Liechtenstein. Okay. This is a joke, of course. It's actually a picture from The Wizard of Oz. This is how they saw them, right? You know, as sort of adorable, little, vulnerable people who couldn't possibly cause any harm. In fact, in newspapers in Switzerland, you'll sometimes find coverage of Liechtenstein issues under Swiss issues. In other words, it'll go through, Bern politics, Swiss politics, including Liechtenstein, even though it's a separate sovereign country, and then they'll deal with foreign countries after that. But they've always been quite protective. They entered into this sweeping arrangement, a customs union, a currency union, diplomatic representation, and so forth. Deal that survived both World War I and the Cold War and proved to be quite successful. Liechtenstein also adopted some of Switzerland's policies with respect to banking secrecy and low corporate tax rates and became extraordinarily wealthy. Liechtenstein is also one of the wealthiest countries on a per capita basis. However, in the 1990s, Liechtenstein decided, along with the Swiss government, that it wanted a closer relationship with the European Union. The European Union had created this thing called the European Economic Area that allowed non-EU countries to benefit from most of the access to the European Union members. Liechtenstein approved it at the encouragement of the prince, by the way, who actually threatened to take his fortune back to Austria if they rejected it. When the Swiss government proposed the deal to the Swiss people, as you can see, the Swiss people rejected the treaty. So now all of a sudden, despite this incredibly close relationship with Switzerland, Liechtenstein was going its own way. The Swiss were a little surprised. I talked to the Swiss ambassador to the UN, who was also the Swiss ambassador to Liechtenstein at the time all of this was going on, and he said there was a little disappointment on their part that Liechtenstein would decide to go forward with this deal with the EU when the Swiss had not. But they decided, again, speaking of trust, to look out for Liechtenstein's interests and to allow them to do this. And for a couple of years, they rewrote all of the treaties, basically, so that Liechtenstein could then draw closer to the European Union. And that seems to have worked out fairly well. I'm sorry. Already, though, we're starting to see a pattern, right? That in most cases, these microstates begin with a very dependent relationship that's sort of open-ended and vague and may reflect a fairly high degree of trust, but over time they seek increased autonomy. They want to extricate themselves from these agreements. Liechtenstein's agreements with Switzerland are unique also. If I talked to the former prime minister of Liechtenstein, who readily admitted this is kind of the way they do business, in that they are extremely detailed, very, very long, very comprehensive, with all sorts of provisions that allow for Liechtenstein to bow out of the arrangement if they want to. Most of them have a 6-month provision for notification for canceling the deal. I'm glad my marriage doesn't have that provision, because there have been times when my wife may have taken me up on that. And likewise, by going to the European Union, Liechtenstein is reducing its dependence on Switzerland considerably, typical of what we would see in just normal politics, as opposed to a sort of trusting relationship. Andorra is a much larger country than Liechtenstein, but only has about the same number of people. We're talking about roughly 50,000 people. It's situated on the border of France and Spain, although historically it was ruled by two co-princes, the French lord of that particular area, who eventually became the King of France, who was eventually replaced by the President of France, and the Roman Catholic Bishop of Urgell. If you can see there, the city right there is the seat of the bishopric, the see of Urgell, and for reasons that made a lot of sense in the Middle Ages but may not make a whole lot of sense in the 21st century, they decided rather than fight over this territory that they would simply jointly govern it. And they allowed the local family elders to run things domestically. That arrangement, believe it or not, continued all the way until 1993, for hundreds of years. Why did it change? Well, partly because Andorra found that both France and the bishop, and eventually Spain, were becoming more and more intrusive in the domestic affairs of Andorra, and they resented that. Even just recently, both the President of France and the Bishop of Urgell have interjected themselves in local Andorran politics, even though there was a new constitution drafted in 1993 that gave the local government much more autonomy and control. There was even proposals sort of floating around out there to establish a republic and to get rid of the co-princes entirely. I don't think they're going to do that, but there's active discussion about it, which was never the case before. Andorra usually survived by pitting these two actors against each other. In fact, that's a local phrase, which is to do the Andorran, which means that you stay kind of aloof, neutral, a little vague about where you stand on things, and try not to take too many open positions on politics, especially when it comes to things like Catalonian independence. People don't even want to talk about that in private for fear that somebody is going to publish it, like I might. Anyway, the geography of Andorra also very hospitable if you want to be left alone, right? It's very, very difficult to get to Andorra, especially from the French side. I could tell you stories. Well, I'll tell you one story. The only way into Andorra from the French side is by bus on switchbacks that I don't think we even have any of in Utah, despite all of our mountains. They are terrifying switchbacks. I happened to be on a small bus that was going up the switchbacks during a snowstorm in May, which was not expected, at least not by me. And the driver, of course, drove as if it were July. And wouldn't you know, at one point, when we're looking at a 1,000-foot drop on one side and a cliff face on the other, the bus actually started to slide sideways. I don't know much about auto mechanics, but I'm pretty sure that vehicles aren't supposed to go sideways like that. That did slow him down. He did decide to drive a little more carefully after he realized he came within 2 feet of falling off the edge of a cliff. But that's how it is to get into. It's easier to get to Andorra from Spain. Andorra, when Spain became a member of the European Union, also decided, along with the new constitution, to establish closer ties to the EU, and along with Liechtenstein and others, join the European Economic Area. They still resent the interference of these co-princes, and like I said, are thinking about becoming a republic. Not sure how far that will go. But again, it shows this pattern that they're trying to get more autonomy, not less. Monaco. This is an odd map of Monaco. If you've been there, you wouldn't recognize it, because I wanted to show you some of the things that have happened to Monaco. Monaco, at one point, was actually taken over by the revolutionary French government. They annexed it for a while. Then it became independent again, contingent on the Prince of Monaco pledging loyalty to France and assuring everybody that he would always take France's interests into account. So France wanted to get that trust in place, but they didn't really trust Monaco. And then for a while, the Kingdom of Savoy took over, and Monaco was sort of able to play both sides off each other until eventually France under Napoleon III defeated the Kingdom of Savoy and said, we will allow Monaco to remain independent if you give us this blue territory here, which is about 90% of the territory of Monaco at the time. Monaco said, well, since you've got that gun to my head, I think I'll go along with your proposal. At which point Monaco became just a shadow of its former self, and France became even more dominant than it was. Basically a colony of France for many, many years. Now, well, there we go. The treaties between Monaco and France are different from some of the other treaties, and my hunch is that a lot of this had to do with France rather than Monaco, which raises an interesting question about my methodology, but that's another story, in that France demanded of Monaco a binding, perpetual commitment from which it could not extricate itself. Now, as it turns out, that wasn't real in the sense that Monaco was able to renegotiate the treaty, as we'll see, but that was the intent back in the 19th century. As far as the geography of Monaco, obviously it didn't look like this in the 19th century, but you can see, once again, we've got topography to its advantage. It's in a canyon or a valley there, I'm not sure what the term is for that, kind of a hollow, with the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea on one side and mountains on the other. And yes, buses go up and down those mountains just like in Andorra, except there was no snow, so that was nice. Anyway, over time, France relaxed its policies on Monaco a bit, but continued to claim the privilege of being able to interfere from time to time. There was a time back under Charles de Gaulle when France basically decided to cut off Monaco in protest over the low tax rates that Monaco had, even though to some degree this was at France's encouragement back in the day. And over time, it just got annoying, and eventually the Monegasques decided to ask for a new treaty with France, and they agreed reluctantly in 2002. I say reluctantly because French President Nicolas Sarkozy continued to threaten cutting off Monaco, and then the EU began to pressure Monaco. So Monaco is perhaps a little bit less fortunate than some of the other microstates in the sense that they're still heavily dependent on France, very vulnerable, but they are eager to extricate themselves from the situation. When I talked to members of the parliament there and so forth, it was obvious that most of them resented the arrangement they had with France, and it wasn't a reflection of their trust in Paris at all, but more along the colonial line. Okay, last country is San Marino. I have not been there yet. I will go this summer. It is an enclave, which makes it unique, right? For a while, though, it was basically part of the Papal States in the Middle Ages until the papacy decided to assert authority, at which point other European powers took exception and actually defended little San Marino. Again, sort of playing the two sides against each other. It somehow managed to survive the Napoleonic period. Some of this may have to do with the fact that there's the castle. I dare you to try to take that castle. It's pretty much impregnable. It's on a narrow mesa. Eventually, though, when Italy became a unified country, San Marino was allowed to remain independent largely because the Italians who had fought for unification had been able to find refuge in San Marino. And so as a gesture of gratitude for helping the country come into existence, they decided to allow San Marino to survive. This doesn't mean that Italy let it do whatever it wanted to. At one point, San Marino proposed building a casino like in Monte Carlo, like in Monaco. Italy said, I don't think so. And also, unlike other countries, San Marino has no security agreement with Italy, although it's clear that nobody would be able to attack San Marino without going through Italy, and so de facto alliance there. Closer ties to the EU, just like all of them. So those are the stories. What's going on? Well, clearly trust has been present at different times, but it's often backfired. Again, like I said before, you can only be betrayed by someone you trust. A lot of these countries, like Luxembourg, found that trust was actually a short-sighted, unwise, imprudent policy. And so most of these microstates are finding alternatives to trust, basically business as usual. They're learning to be shrewd, right? They're learning to play major powers against each other in order to secure as much autonomy as they can. They're trying to even be creative by going to international institutions. They've all joined the UN now, for instance, and most of them have a closer tie with the European institutions. At the same time, they're approaching it sort of like it's just business, right? Not that there's any close emotional or spiritual connection to these countries, but these are the major powers that can provide services. The microstates, in turn, can show some loyalty and behave themselves without disrupting the status quo too much. And the end result is everybody gets a little bit of what they want, which is pretty much how international politics goes in the real world. And that's all I have to say for now. Thank you for your attention.
We've got about 10 minutes. We invite you to queue up at the mic, tell us your name and what you're studying. And I guess while you're lining up, the first question I'll start with, I'm curious about the Vatican City. In some lists, I see Vatican City included. What was your thinking on that? And obviously a connection to San Marino.
Right. Well, first of all, Vatican is, to me, the headquarters of a billion-member NGO. First and foremost. And so in terms of its international relations, it's sui generis. It just doesn't fit with typical international politics. I thought about it, and the fact is that the Holy See as a political entity First of all, of course, it used to be much larger and has shrunk down to just a postage stamp size. It has a tense relationship with Italy, and I'm not sure that there's any trust at all there. Italy, for the most part, has been a secular, anti-clerical state. Needless to say, the Holy See is not. And it's just been a tense relationship since, the 1860s and so forth. So if anything, it would strengthen my argument. So I didn't want to make it too easy on myself. Other questions? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam Dearden. Studying history. And you mentioned that there wasn't a lot of agreement between Catalonians and the people from Andorra. Now, they share a common language. Is that all they share? Do they not share any kind of historical or more ties than that? Because I'm thinking that Catalan is a pretty unique language in the fact that it's very confined to that area.
Sure. I don't know a lot of details about that other than just, yes, historically the people have migrated back and forth. Andorra is not real accessible, so it hasn't been real pronounced. There were a lot of French immigrants for a while. Right. But my sense is that the Andorran people, at least the ones I talked to, have gone back and forth on this. There was a time when Andorrans felt very close, sort of emotionally, socially, and so forth, to the French. The French have had a tendency, however, this may not surprise you, to throw their weight around a little bit too much and to be, a tad arrogant. Right. Go figure. And so the bloom is off the rose. People aren't really as enamored with the French over the last 15, 20 years. And, the alternative is Spain. But the Catalonian issue is extremely volatile, extremely dangerous. And the Andorrans, having survived by sort of holding their cards close to their vest, have just decided as a community to keep their mouths shut. Okay. I mean, I try to ask people directly, I try to ask them indirectly, and they would just say, well, we do have an affinity for Catalonia, but this is an internal matter for the Spanish people and the Catalonians, right. The party line. American embassy says to you, so. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of it. I suspect that if Catalonia became independent, all bets would be off, and Andorra and Catalonia would become fast friends. But for now, don't ask.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Daniel Taylor. I'm studying sociology. And your conclusions, you said it's all business. There's not much emotion involved. Are you an advocate of trust in international relations? And if so, would you advocate greater emotion being involved in those relationships?
I think it's fine for world leaders to trust each other. And that can actually be very productive, especially if the two countries have had a hostile relationship for a time. Again, referring to Reagan and Gorbachev, I think that was a wonderful thing that they hit it off. Mm-hmm. I remember a time when George W. Bush thought that he was going to be just as close to Vladimir Putin. That didn't work out so well, and it made Bush look like a fool, frankly. And I think there's a danger in that, in relying on emotion, relying on a sort of spiritual connection between heads of state, because heads of state, after all, have an oath to protect their countries, and it needs to be about more than just their own personal relationships. I would get nervous. In fact, I was heartened in the State of the Union address when President Obama described the relationship with Iran and said, we are negotiating with Iran, but we do not trust Iran. We are moving forward tentatively. If they follow through, then great, we'll go to the next step. If they don't, all bets are off. And I thought, yeah, I'm glad to know that my president is approaching international politics that way. So, yeah, I think trust is more risky than a lot of people realize. I think distrust, and the sort of attitude that maybe the North Koreans take toward the world is toxic. We've got to get past that. But I don't know that trust is necessarily the panacea that a lot of people are saying. That's the main reason I wrote the book, actually.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Or am writing the book, I should say.
I'm Connor Kreutz, studying international relations. You said that all of the microstates have gained more autonomy in the past years, but I'm curious, how did the states fare in relation to their, I guess you could say, like their former older brothers during the European economic crisis?
Most of them didn't do real well. But it's relative. You know, the problem for Andorra, for example, is fewer tourists. And so the country has taken a hit because they had come to depend a lot on the skiers and so forth. It is, by the way, an exquisitely beautiful country. My wife and I plan to retire there, if I have anything to say about it. But, you know, when the French are broke, they don't go skiing in Andorra anymore. You know, they stay closer to home. Luxembourg, historically, not only one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but also a country with very, very low unemployment, 2%, 1%, you know. When I visited there was actually a little tiny bit of skepticism about the European Union, especially from young people, college-age people, because the unemployment rate had topped 5%. Now, for the rest of the world, especially, I don't know, Spain, with over 20% unemployment, they're sort of not real sympathetic. But for Luxembourg, this was a crisis of sorts. And so, yeah, these last few years have not been good. They're all realizing that committing to being more engaged with the European Union also carries some risks. At the same time, I think they're all committed to it. I think they also realize they don't have a lot of options. It's not as if they're going to join NAFTA or something, or Russia. And so I think their feeling is to just make the best of it and see where it goes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any final questions? All right. Well, thanks, Professor Stiles, and thanks for your attendance today.
And thank you for coming.